1, the field of human development, the lifespan perspective. In this part of Chapter 1, we're going to talk about the field of human development, the importance of studying lifespan development, the historical perspectives on human development, the domains and principles of development, and the phases of developmental change. So, starting off, we're going to talk about what is human development, the field, who studies human development, and the importance of studying it in the first place. So, lifespan development follows human growth from infancy, actually before that, preconception, to infancy, all the way up into older adulthood. So, it's how we grow and change over time. And we grow in many different ways. In fact, there's 3 domains of our growth over time. We grow physically, which is known as our physical development. We grow cognitively, which is our memory, our thinking, our problem solving, things that happen in the brain. And then emotional and social development. So, physical development, this is the growth changes in things like bones, muscles, how our size gets bigger, we get taller, we gain weight from when we were born. Our movement, our capabilities of moving with our fine and our gross motor skills, and our strength. It also changes in our sensory capabilities. So, sensory capabilities are our senses. So, seeing, smelling, touching, tasting, hearing. And those changes happen over time. And then also the quality of our health and our nutrition. All of this is part of our physical development. Cognitive, like I said, is changes in our memory, our problem solving, and our thinking. And it also deals with language development. And then emotional and social, sometimes you'll hear this called social emotional development. This is changes in our self concept, our personality, how we deal with our feelings, how we regulate our feelings, and our relationships with other people. So, the goal of human development is to do these things. It's to describe human development. So, what does it look like? To understand human development. Why do these things happen in infancy? Why do these things happen in older adulthood? And to explain it. Understand and explain. Also, to identify factors that promote development. So, what are the things that cause us to develop in these ways? Also, to identify factors that inhibit us. So, what stops us from being able to regulate our emotions or to develop physically in a certain way? Are there environmental things that are happening? Are they cognitive or social things that are happening? Risk factors. And also to help individuals struggling in their development. So, how can we help others, especially when there may be a mental disorder or a physical illness or a mental illness? How can we help them to understand so that we can help them? So, in regard to the 3 domains, human development is very interdisciplinary. It's not just biology, it's not just psychological, and it's not just sociocultural. It's all of these things combined together to understand who we are as humans. Why do we do the things we do? What is the impact on the environment on who we are as people? So it's things like social, so social support, families, medical care, poverty, also psychological, how we learn our emotions, our memories, and biological as well. So what is our genetic predisposition? What are we born with? And how does that interact with the environment outside? Because biology in general is just one part of us, but it's also impacted by all these different things. And you can't remove one of these from human development because we're all of these things will impact us. And we're going to talk about that a lot more throughout the course. So, career applications. So, human development, there's a lot of people that have to understand human development. Education, research, counseling, because they want to understand people and their behaviors and the expectations. There's a reason we don't teach kindergartners algebra. We don't come in and say 2 plus x equals 4. What's X? We don't do that because that is not developmentally appropriate for that age group. However, we do say 2 plus blank equals 4. What's the blank? And then they'll say 2. But we don't put things in like variables, X, Y, Z, in kindergarten because they're just learning number sense. So we have to really understand the age group in which we're dealing with. Whereas we wouldn't just say 2 plus blank equals 4 in high school because now they're ready to be able to understand more abstract things. And as we get to each age group individually, we'll talk about what those common norms and expectations and characteristics of the ages look like in regard to their physical, cognitive, and social emotional development. Medical and mental health, they also have to understand human development so that they can recognize the factors that influence development and the expectations for the period and the domain of development. And then citizens, everybody, nonprofit organization, private sectors, government work, and policymakers. They also need to know about human development because they're the ones that they're influenced by voting and advocating to protect people. So knowing what is developmentally appropriate is really important when we're listening to people give their campaign speeches and things like that so that we know that they really have the best interests for the citizens of our country. So this is a time where we're going to pause and process what we just talked about. And in just a second, you're going to have something that pops up that's going to ask you to answer these 3 questions. So as an overview, what does the study of human development seek to address? What careers can a person with a degree in human development seek out? And which of the following is not a reason to study human development? So moving on to the next part, historical perspectives on human development. Well, historical perspectives have changed over time. And as we go through, we're going to see how these have changed. Well, back in the time of John Locke, it was believed that people were blank slates. They came into the world not knowing right and wrong, that the outside factors of society, social, family shaped and made them who they are as people. So tabula rasa is the absence of a preconceived idea. Ultimately, it just means they came in with a clean slate. The human mind was completely blank. Once they entered into the world, that is when they started comprehending and understanding the world and learning. Nativism and imperialism. These are a human's capacity to have inborn or acquired through experience. So the nativist view holds that human beings enter the world in with an inborn stored knowledge. They come in knowing what is right and what is wrong. However, on the other side, imperialists like John Locke believe that it's all based off of experience and interactions with the world, and that we come in with a blank slate instead of the nativists who believe that we come in with a preconceived knowledge of what is right and wrong in our world. Active and passive learning. Also, some historical things. There's some people that believe that learning is an active process, whereas others believe that learning is a passive process. Well, depending on how you look at it, active process is when people learn by doing something, which means that they have to actually be reflecting on their experience, touching it, manipulating it, doing it themselves. Now, the part with active learning is that this requires time, effort, and the individual has to have interest in what it is that they're doing, or they're not going to want to do it. It's kind of hard to learn to do something when you don't have a purpose for knowing it. So examples of this may be things like internship, research experience, practicums. Passive learning, on the other hand, these are things like lectures and some discussions. So the knowledge is given to a group to disseminate, which means you get all this information, but you may never have to do anything with it. And in the case of this class, we do a little bit of both because there is a time to be giving information in a large group setting, but there's also a time for you to actually apply it and have an active learning process to where you learn and reflect upon what you were given during a passive learning session. So in passive learning, students may not process the material as deeply, especially if it doesn't help them prepare for their future career. So at the end of this course, we're going to be learning about all these age ranges, and I'm going to have you apply what you've learned to your future career, because all of us in one way, shape, or form are going to be interacting with people or making things for people that has to be appropriate for their age ranges and their needs. So it's really important to have a balance between these two, but to know the difference as well. So passive is where you're just given a bunch of information. Active is where you actually act and do something with the information. So another thing with historical human development is this theory or this idea that we develop continuously or we develop discontinuously. Continuously means that as we grow, we have a beginning and we just keep going. There's no check boxes or steps that we have to conquer to get to the next level. And some of the theorists and some of the things we're going to be reading about throughout this class, some of these theorists say that learning is continuous. You never stop learning, and you don't have to master a certain thing to go to the next thing, that you continuously just keep developing over time. Discontinuous, on the other hand, say that there are certain steps that you have to take to get to a certain process, especially in regard to like cognitive thinking. So to be able to be an abstract thinker, you have to have concrete understanding of certain concepts. So discontinuous, in this case, is a process in which new ways of understanding and responding happen at certain times. Whereas continuous says it just happens and it just keeps going and you keep developing. Whereas discontinuous says there are certain stages or certain steps where these happen and we see them. And it's very qualitative changes as well in regard to things like thinking, feeling, behaving that are characterized into specific periods. So it's more to do with our emotions and the things that are very inside of us. Whereas continuous may be a little bit more of what's seen on the outside. So for instance, we grow, we go through puberty, we change, we get taller, we gain weight. That would be a continuous process. Whereas discontinuous would be more like we have to understand number sense before we can add. And number sense is just understanding that one means one object, and it can be seen in many different ways. So it could be one piece of candy, it could be the number one, it could be a Roman numeral one, it could be a smiley face for one. And we're going to talk about that more as well, but that was just an example for you. So universalism or relativism. Well, some of historical human development believes that moral truth is the same for all people at all times, at all places throughout the world. So no matter who you are, moral truth is the same for everybody, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your religion, regardless of your gender, regardless of anything. Whereas moral relativism says that moral truth is not the same for all people at all times and at all places. Moral truth is relative, and it really involves the individual and their culture. But again, these are old historical things that people used to think, but now they're starting to move to, okay, well, we used to think that everybody thought the same way, but now they don't. And this is all developed through theories that we're going to learn a little bit more about in this chapter when we get to that section. So here's another time where we are going to pause and process what we have discussed and what you have read in your textbook. So answer these questions, go back and refer to the previous slides as needed to help you as you address these questions. So the domains and principles of human development. Again, human development is very interdisciplinary. It's biological, psychological, and social. And we can't remove one aspect of it when we talk about it. We talk about them all together because they intermingle amongst each other. So, the domains of human development. Well, there's physical changes, there's social emotional changes, and there's cognitive changes. And again, it's kind of like a giant circle, and it's a cycle. And all of these things will impact the other. And we're going to talk about that a lot throughout this course. So, the principles of developmental exchange. Well, first off, development is lifelong. There is no age period that dominates development. Now, there's age periods where there's a rapid growth in development, but we are always growing and changing as individuals, physically, cognitively, and socially emotionally. Development is also multi-dimensional, which means development consists of all these different aspects. We don't just stop our physical development when we hit a certain age. There may be a time where it gets a little quieter and it's not as rapid of a change, but development is always happening. Same thing with cognitive. We're always growing and being able to think and process and regulate our emotions more. And then as we get a little bit older, we start to have decline. But there is always something happening in regards to our development. It's also multi-directional, which involves the processes of maintenance and decline. Maintenance is getting the ability to be able to do things and to be independent. But as we get older, so when we're younger, we're very much dependent on caregivers, and then we become adults and we have that independence, and we live that for a pretty long amount of time before we go back to that dependence with the decline of our physical capabilities, our cognitive, and maybe even our social emotional capabilities as well. It's also continuous. So early development will influence later development. What happens to individuals as a child will impact what happens to them as an adult. Nature also versus nurture is part of development as well, which goes into that what we learn when we're younger does impact how we are as individuals later. So nature versus nurture, we're going to talk about that in just a second, but nature deals with biology and nurture deals with how we are brought up, the impacts that we have, or the different contexts that we have with friends, caregivers, medical care, all those things will impact our development. And then also context, where we are in the world, what's around us as individuals. So nature versus nurture. This explains that development involves complex interactions between biology, environment, and individual actions. And one of the biggest debates historically in human development is which one is more important. Is nature more important or is nurture more important? Well, all of us are born into the world with a genetic predisposition. Heredity, genes, biological processes, maturation, all of those are going to impact how we come into the world and especially how individuals interact with us outside of our world. So if we're born with a genetic disorder, we're going to have a specific nurturing thing that happens to us based off of the needs of the individual. But the nurture part cannot be pulled apart and said, well, they're either born being intelligent or not. That is a very much called a fixed mindset when you think that you're born with something. Now, we come into the world born with all sorts of different things that make us who we are. But the nurture aspect really can impact what happens with the genetic predisposition that we're born with. So things like education, parenting styles, the environment, social policies are going to have a big impact on who we are as individuals. Context is also something that's going to have a major impact on our development as people. And context deals with us in the middle and then everything that is outside of us. So things like family, parenting, culture, community, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, generational cohorts. Those things really push down upon a person. So if we think about this as a person's bubble, all these different aspects are coming at us at one time. And just like human development being interdisciplinary, context is also intersectional, which means that we can't remove these different contexts from pushing upon us. We can't just say, okay, I'm going to be female today. That's all I'm going to be. I'm not going to be English today. I'm not going to be this today. I'm not going to be my age. This is all I'm going to be. Contexts are all these things that we are at one time. And these contexts influence all aspects of who we are. It impacts our behaviors and the interpretations of behaviors, especially morally. What we see is right and wrong. Beliefs, traditions, values, knowledge, resources for development, where we're born, what socioeconomic status, what schools we're going to go to, who's in our neighborhood. All of these things are intersectional and are going to have a big impact on our development as individuals. So family structures is a really big thing that we have to talk about, and we'll talk about this a lot throughout the class. But there's a lot of different types of families, especially today. So we have a nuclear family, which is the idealistic of what family is. Husband, wife, one or more children. However, today, that is not the common family structure that we see. Even though TV is getting better, they still show a lot of nuclear families, or a lot of them also turn to things like the blended family. But there's a lot of other family structures that do have a big impact on a human's development, especially in regard to our society. We got to take societal pushing down and what people view as acceptable. So when we have people protesting about same-sex marriage or adoption or fostering or any type of thing where they're talking about it, that can have a big impact on how a person views their family structure. So some common types of family structures that you can see, this is not all of them, would be the nuclear family, which is the husband, the wife, and children. The cohabitation, which may be where families live together, but they may not be married, or they may have a civil partnership. An extended family, this is very common, where the families have grandparents, aunts, uncles that may live with them. Lone parent, which is a single parent with children. An adopted or fostering, where a family in which they'll have children that may have been adopted, or they may be fostered, or they may be with other people that foster more than one child. And then you have your blended, which is taking one family and another family and merging them together. You can kind of think of that as the Brady Bunch. And then your same-sex families, where a family where both parents are the same gender. And then you also have the beanpole family, and this refers to the shape in the tree and the meaning of families with very small numbers of children. So you may have a large family or a really small family. You may have a single child family. You may have a child that has a lot of siblings as well. And all of those things are going to impact how a person develops. So, parenting styles is something we're going to talk a lot about in regard to the age ranges because parents do things differently when children are little compared to when children are adolescents and then later when children are adults. So, there are four main types of parenting styles. We have permissive parents, authoritative parents, authoritarian parents, and uninvolved or neglectful parents. And they're either on a continuum of being very high in responsiveness but being demanding, very high in responsiveness and being controlled or strictness may be low, or they may be low in warmth but be demanding, or low in warmth and be controlling or strict, and low in controlling or strict. Now, as we can look at some of these things here, we can kind of see on this side of the spectrum that these may not be the most positive types of parenting styles. So things like you're the boss, few rules, low expectations. We're going to learn a lot throughout this course that children do need boundaries. So when there are not boundaries and things for safety, there can be some very negative side effects, especially in regard to being uninvolved or neglectful. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, your authoritative and authoritarian, those are a little bit different, where the responsiveness may be high, meaning that they may be loving and have demands, or they may be demanding but really not as loving. And sometimes parents will go back and forth between different quadrants of parenting styles as well. So they don't have to strictly be authoritarian all the time, saying things like, it's my house, my rules, do it because I said so. They may talk about it more, which makes it a little bit different. And it kind of depends on the situation and the circumstances, and also the temperament of the child as well. So there's a lot of factors in play with this. And we'll talk about this a lot more as we go, but they can really shape a person's development throughout a lifespan. Also, things like race and ethnicity and culture can really have a big impact as well. Now, race and ethnicity, first off, are technically two different things, but a lot of people and a lot of forms and documents that you may see put them together. Race in general is considered a biological classification. These are things that can be seen on the outside. These are physical appearances. Whereas ethnicity, on the other hand, is a cultural identity. So if you speak a different language or you dress or you have a certain religion, that is part of your ethnicity. Whereas race is more of a biological, physical characteristic. Now, culture can be many, many, many different things. Culture is this giant umbrella of how we act, what we find appropriate, our mannerisms for teaching, our religion, all these different things. And it can have a really big impact on our development over time, depending on what we're exposed to and what we're not exposed to. Socioeconomic status is something that will really have a big impact as well. And socioeconomic status is oftentimes known as someone's SES status. And it deals with income levels, education, work experience, and the prestige or status of someone's job. And depending on someone's socioeconomic status, this can cause a certain position. And social class, again, is more than just income or money. It's where you're situated in society, where you live, what neighborhood you're in. And poverty is a really big part of it because it can really cause people not to be able to understand where you're coming from or how to interact with somebody. And it's easy to say, well, I understand, but do we really understand what it means when somebody says, I didn't have this technology at my school, or there was this type of crime in my neighborhood. Some of us can never even imagine what that's like. And it really does have a big impact on our development as individuals, because our socioeconomic status is going to have a big impact on where we're situated in geographically and culturally. Also, this is something known as generational cohorts. This has a big impact on our development as well. When we were born and what was around during that time has a very big impact on who we are as individuals. Now, a lot of us in class are considered Generation Z, which is anyone that's really born after the year of 1995. Some of us may consider ourselves millennials or Generation Ys, whereas some of us actually may fall into this spectrum of being a Generation Z. Now, going back and thinking about the people who influenced us, our parents would be in these generations, depending on when they had children. Grandparents, teachers, they have a very different view of what life was like. So some of your teachers may have been around when the Berlin Wall fell, or when the AIDS epidemic came to be. Whereas some of your parents may be Generation Ys, and they were around when the 9/11 attacks occurred. They were actually there and heard it and saw it. They may have actually been in it. But a lot of the generations that are coming up today, this is ancient history to some of them. They don't know a world without tablets or smartphones. And it's really cute because they'll ask you things like, what do you mean you didn't have Netflix when you were little? You couldn't watch whatever you wanted whenever you wanted to? Well, no, we had to wait for Saturday morning for the cartoons to come up, or we had to use the TV guide. What do you mean you can't record something? You couldn't record your TV shows. Because they're born into a certain culture to where it's just there. They don't know how it got there. And that's going to have a really big impact on their human development as well, because they're going to expect it to be there and they don't understand what it's like to not have certain things, or to live in a time when the Cold War was happening or when there was terrorist attacks. So there are three contextual contexts for influences on a person. The first one is known as normative age graded influences. And these are the experiences that people around the same age will experience. So things like puberty or retirement, they're all having it happen around the same time. Whereas a normative history graded influence are life experiences that are unique to that cohort. So, like I was saying, if we go back a second, the baby boomers were in the time of the Cold War. Generation Y was in the time of 9/11 and ISIS. That would be known as a normative history graded influence, because that was unique to their time. So the children that are being growing up today, and even not going to be grown in the future, are going to have different normative history graded influences. And our normative history graded influences are going to be what they learn about in history books. And it's going to have a very big impact on their contextual understanding for their human development. And the third one is non normative life event influences. And these are events that most people do not experience. So things like being homeschooled, or living abroad, or moving, or speaking more than one language. That would be known as a non normative life event influence. And again, being homeschooled is going to have a big impact on especially social emotional development, um, because they may not know how to interact with people like they would if they would have been in a public school or even a private school setting. private school would be an example as well of a non-normative life event. There are people that go to private schools and some people that don't. So those are specific things that are influential context to a specific person's development based off of their individual influences and context. So here's a time where we're going to pause again and we are going to address a question based off of what we have covered so far. So now we're going to talk about the phases of developmental change over time. Throughout this course, we're going to be talking about these specific stages of lifespan. So we're going to be talking about the prenatal, which is conception to birth, infancy and toddlerhood, which is birth to about age 2, early childhood, which is ages 2 to 6. So that's about preschool to about first grade, middle childhood, ages 6 to 11, which is first grade to about 6th grade, adolescence, which is ages 11 to 18, but some people say it's actually to about age 20. So that's even going into the college years. So that's middle school to high school or even going into college. Early adulthood, which is about ages 18 or 20, depending on who you're reading, to about age 40. So that is during the time of college, maybe forming relationships, maybe getting married, having children, moving into getting a career. But depending on a person, they have different goals for their life. And we'll talk about that when we get to adulthood. And then middle adulthood is 40 to 65, and then a late adulthood is considered 65 years to death. So, conceptions of age. Well, there's a couple of different types of ages that we're going to talk about, which really comprise of these 4, which is known as your chronological age, which is the numbers of years since you were born, your biological age, which is your age in terms of your physical health, your psychological age, which is your adaptive capacity compared with others of the same chronological age. So this could be an example of somebody saying, you're very mature for your age. That may be a psychological age or maybe even a social age, depending on how you interact with your environment. And then social age, these are your social roles and expectations related to your chronological age. So these may be where people say things like you're mature for your age. So here we're going to stop again and we're going to pause to process what we have talked about so far. And that is the end for Chapter 1, Part